How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another incredible session here at Osquery at Scale. I'm going to be your moderator for this session. I'm Chris Cochran, co-host of the Hacker Valley Studio podcast, and we have an incredible guest here that's going to share some wisdom with us. Teddy Reed, Osquery contributor and community advocate. Without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Teddy for a few words, and then we're going to get into some Q&A after.
Hey, Chris. Thanks a lot for that intro. We kind of wanted to kick this off, the QA, with a bit of a retrospective of Osquery. This is a little bit of a different talk than I've given in the past, so bear with me here. I hope it's going to be enjoyable. So, okay, I wanted to kind of talk about principles and ideals that shaped Osquery. But before we start, I want to jump in, give you the bottom line right up front, and mention some key takeaways for this discussion. First is, I propose that our community, everyone working on Osquery, using Osquery, is impressively strong right now. And in my opinion, we can grow even stronger by increasing shared ownership and collective knowledge of Osquery. The second takeaway is, I suppose, that our progress has been greatly influenced by Osquery's principles, as well as the biases brought by stakeholders. It's also influenced by productivity, a collaborative and respectful environment, and a myriad of other factors, but I feel that these flow down from principles. And a heads up that you can apply this observation to your own projects by asking yourself what your design principles are and what biases you and your stakeholders bring. So where is Osquery right now? I say this with a degree of humility, but I think it's safe to say Osquery is successful. It's widely used, and we are learning about new use cases each day. So I'd like to look back about how we got here, and I feel that principles and biases influence this success. So to set the stage, let's look at the project origin. Mike Arpaia came up with the idea and wrote the initial implementation, and it's important to know that he had built a tool like Osquery before and wanted to build a scalable version too. So when he started, he brought the power of hindsight. And Mike was part of a security team using a closed source EDR and wanted more agency over expanding scope of the capabilities and wanted a solution for production Linux. So he brought the power of motivation and purpose. Shortly after the first few lines were written, he passively recruited several people who brought a shared love of open source. And it's hard to describe what I mean by love, but I'm guessing it was a mix of wanting to promote the team, showing an open example of what we do internally, disrupting the EDR space a little bit, and working on something novel. So what he had was essentially a mission, a motivation, and the experience. And I'll quote that these are usually all you need to be successful in internal projects, regardless of the size of the problem you're solving. But Osquery started with something more, something not uncommon for larger open source projects. And that is a defined set of first principles. These are foundational propositions that sort of stand alone. They were and are: be transparent, be agnostic, and respect the system. So now the bulk of this presentation is analyzing the effect of these principles on Osquery's growth. So for principles to work, they should be at the center of architectural decisions, and they should be obvious project differentiators, meaning someone is very likely to choose to use Osquery due to one of these propositions. I'll zoom in on the guidelines for development, and these roll up into the respect the system principle. I believe that the set of guidelines is one of the coolest Osquery features. One fun fact is that these were spoken institutional knowledge for almost 4 years before Lauren Pearl codified them into our contributing doc. I feel that at that moment, there was a positive inflection point for Osquery, as it made contributions easier, and we implicitly started to harden the code base against any violations. The guidelines are an extension of the principles and make up the soul of Osquery, where the heart is the actual capability and the value add that people create from using the tool. Still today, we take these violations very seriously. In fact, last month in December, we issued a security advisory for a query that could create SQLite databases to disk. That would be a violation of changing the system state. So principles naturally feel pure, and so they're met with impurities, which are the biases introduced by contributors. I like to think that projects start out with principles and are subsumed by the biases of contributors. I don't want to speak in absolutes, but I feel that that is unavoidable. And this is not grim tidings, simply we must be aware of our biases and the biases of those that have strong influence over our project. In my opinion, the common biases introduced by Osquery's regular contributors are a desire to deploy, it says broadly on the slide, but it really means deploy everywhere, a desire to reduce the code size, and an adherence to secure development practices. In our case, these biases are positive. They do add complexity at various levels, but also contribute to the project's success. And when I say complexity, I really mean it. Someone once described the Osquery build process as building a secondary OS. I'll say that my bias to reduce size has slowed down Osquery development by a lot. Anytime an idea to reduce code size popped into my head, I instantly had this squirrel reaction. I would drop everything in tunnel vision for hours until it was 4 something in the morning and the birds started singing. The current size of Osquery on Linux is something like 31 megabytes. In 2016, I had this ridiculous idea that if we went over 20 megabytes, we would cross some unforgivable line. There was one week where I was convinced we could make UPX packing work. I had a proof of concept that used UPX packing working for Osquery that reduced the binary size by 80%. But the downside was the unpacked version would live in memory and, well, was taking more memory. And actually, if you read UPX documentation for the unpacker, it's not really guaranteed to work at all. And it was flagged at least 5 times on VirusTotal as malware for simply using that unpacking stub. Anyway, I reflect on that bias occasionally, and setting aside my aggregate loss of productivity, I really hope it didn't get in the way of people's ideas, such as bringing in more third-party libraries. And so even though we have positive principles and positive biases, things go wrong. I believe we can trace these issues back to an over-rotation, such as my personal UPX fiasco. For example, our bias to minimize performance overhead has led us to eagerly aborting using a watchdog. Most of us have seen this like, Osquery workers stopped, memory limits exceeded. And if instead we had a bias towards correctness, then perhaps we would have found an alternate way to handle these exceptional circumstances. Similarly, by refusing to shell out, like speaking bluntly, this limits the data available to us because shell tools are a common abstraction for private operating system APIs. Additionally, if you look closely at our code, sometimes we trade using a shell command for using unsupported behavior when we open dilibs at runtime and call API signatures and then call methods on them. Our guideline to seek uniformity within table schema has led to an over-abstraction as well. For example, Osquery was designed to be a point-in-time view of the operating system represented as a relational database. This is accurate. However, there is a small subtlety and disconnect in what was implemented and what was intended. We didn't know it at the time, but a language like QL is a closer approximation of the intended abstraction. I do not mean to say that, and nor do I think that SQL is the wrong choice, but you'll notice that we bend rules to achieve some goals, such as using query predicates as functional parameters. What I have on the slide here is a where clause where you set UID equal to 0. What the intention of that is calling a method where you provide a parameter UID equals 0. So you'll also notice that our over-abstraction has led to complexities with the event space tables. These tend to have steep learning curves and are hard to reason about. And from a data collection capability standpoint, Osquery is both an abstraction of the operating system concepts like processes and users, as well as a tool to buffer and query streaming data, such as process starts and socket opens. Perhaps both of these types of data should not have been abstracted into the same relational database table interface. All right, so maybe that was too much over-analysis of what has gone wrong. To lighten the mood a bit, Chris suggested I add a knock-knock joke or something like that. So Chris, why did the chicken cross the road?
To get to the other side?
Well, if there was a where clause, then it would have been an inner join. You get it? SQL cross joins function like inner joins if there's a query predicate. Why did they
Loved
cross
it.
the road?
Incredible.
All right,
I go on the road.
Anyway, back to the presentation. Let's back up now and talk about how principles and biases have treated us well. I think what is worth reinforcing is that the guidelines are consistently a top reason why people choose Osquery. But maybe not so obvious is that our principle to be transparent has gifted us durability, and our agnosticism has grown a shared ownership within the community. What do I mean by durability here? It's almost a textbook reading of the term, an ability to withstand wear, pressure, or challenge. From the beginning, Osquery's code, documentation, processes, everything has been 99% kept on GitHub. There were very few code syncs, and most of the features were built iteratively with pull requests explaining the changes with issues linked to bug or feature requests. That history is audible. And this meant that new people could ramp up and to the project could later be easily relocated. And I have a not so scale timeline of challenges that we endured, most likely due to this transparency. I would go so far as to say that an open project cannot build a strong community unless the project is durable. I'll also state that we both have strong shared ownership within the community, and that to continue to grow the project, we must continue to expand shared ownership. This means from a code and documentation perspective, more people are becoming regular contributors, but also from a knowledge perspective, we should advocate for more blogs, tutorials, retrospectives, and the like. And perhaps most importantly, grow the strength and number of products that use and integrate with Osquery. I feel that our principle to be agnostic has set us up for success here. We purposely created opportunity for others like our host Upticks to fill a gap and share ownership for Osquery's success. From an end user perspective, this meant Osquery would never be a turnkey solution, but there would always be a way to fit the tool into your pipeline. I show this graph here because every presentation is better with a graph, but also to visualize how code ownership has changed over time. The more colors you see here, the better. And you can observe the positive effect adoption as a Linux Foundation project has had to this shared ownership. Thanks to Mike Myers and the Hercules tool for building this visualization. So I've mentioned what I think went wrong, what I think went well, but all in all, where has that led us? Like, what do we have today? The principles originally set up as engineering and design principles have built us a project and have built us a community. You know, what the slide says here is pretty accurate. We came together because we agreed on first principles, we shared a common problem, and we discussed a diverse set of instantiations of that problem. We sort of stayed together because Osquery is a flexible solution, and we use our diverse experiences to apply that solution. So I've come this far in the presentation, and I have not mentioned exactly what problem we are solving with Osquery. Somewhat by design, we don't prescribe that problem exactly. You do. And so Osquery does nothing. It really is nothing without you and how you apply it. You're the community, and as the title alludes to, you are the shape of Osquery. So check it out. These are the principles we started with. They've guided the initial design decisions and have been influencing the project over the last 6 years. I feel strongly they brought us here, kept us here, and that they will help us to continue to grow. Once again, our community is strong, and we can grow stronger by increasing shared ownership and collective knowledge. Progress is influenced by principles and biases. And when you contribute to Osquery and when you build your own projects, be mindful of the biases that you bring and be prepared for setbacks and challenges. Use them to learn and use them to grow. So, hey, that's my little spiel. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll turn the mic over to Chris to host some Q&A.
That was an awesome spiel. Definitely appreciate the time, not only for the presentation, but be willing to have a conversation with me and the rest of the folks on the call today. If anyone has any questions, be sure to drop them into the discussion box, and I'll be sure to share them as we go through the Q&A. So Teddy, first, I definitely wanted to jump into a little bit about your origin story. How did you even get into this incredible field? And then also, why Osquery? How did that resonate with you to make you such a pivotal part to the project?
Sure. I'll try to condense the story a little bit. I think it started out with, like most people, trying to hack games. You play games with your friends. At that time, the games I was playing were sort of like couch multiplayer. So open up a memory editor, removing some integers here and there, fixing some integers here and there, gave you a leg up. When I got into college, I wanted to build games, design games. That's kind of why I went to college. Within the first 2 weeks, I found out there's a lot of math involved, and it was a little bit over my head. So I went to search for what else I could do and found security. So that's the origin story of security. I'll fast forward really far into when I joined Facebook. I joined Facebook to work on some infrastructure challenges. And I had a friend there, Mike, and he kind of sat across the room. He would stop by every once in a while to let me know what he was working on. We had a kind of friendly, collaborative environment amongst everyone that was working there. I would stop by his desk and figure out what he was working on. And we sort of started hacking on Osquery after he had a couple initial versions up. And it just kind of expanded a lot of the amount of work to do. So I found myself like spending most of the time working on Osquery. It's a lot of fun. And so we just kind of decided like, hey, why don't we do this full time? Why don't we see how far we can take this? And so I moved to that team and started working on Osquery full time for a couple of years.
That's awesome. It seems like Osquery has this tremendous philosophical foundation. And I know you mentioned during your presentation that it was due to the iterative commits, just iterating over and over and over again. But what else would you say contributed to that philosophical base that is Osquery?
One, I think I'll reinforce that I think Mike is a very idealistic person. He sort of brings those ideals to the projects that he works on. That's definitely a big factor. I think another one was the folks around us brought a lot of perspective of using EDR type solutions in the past and sort of their understanding of what goes well and what hasn't gone well. So, just like a lot of engineers in a room, we want to capture all of what has gone wrong in the past. And we always think that we can build the next solution that solves all the problems. So I think in this case, we did have a lot of those opinions, a lot of those perspectives. We sort of saw all of the problems that we wanted to solve. And with those ideals, it was like, hey, let's be extremely flexible here. Let's not like integrate specifically with one other product or one other way that you do something. For example, we like deploy with Chef at the time. We wanted to make sure that the way people deployed Osquery didn't have to be Chef. It could be anything. Similarly, we have dependency management sort of figured out for ourselves. And so we could have taken an easy track and just used that existing dependency management to deploy Osquery quickly. But we put ourselves in the shoes of a lot of people around there, a lot of people around the space, and a couple of common problems that they had were supporting like an older version of Linux, and they've kept it up to date. They've sort of put the elbow grease in to make sure that older version of Linux is still production ready, but it doesn't have all of the sort of dependencies that you would expect from a modern operating system. So we wanted to support those people. We wanted to support that use case. So again, we sort of put the kitchen sink into the project and made sure that dependency management would solve that use case too.
Awesome. We have a question from Brendan. Do you think there's room for changing the principles and carving out exceptions?
Interesting question.
It is.
I think there's always room. Yes. I think there's room for changing the principles. I think so I'll back up a second. I think we're in a good place right now with the structure and processes that the Linux Foundation has asked for us. We're getting better here, and that comes down to like we document how we do things. So we meet every 2 weeks to sort of discuss more long-term problems that we're solving on the project, discuss like hot topics, as well as just try to make some progress on pull requests. So we have that process documented. The same thing with how we release. Like before, there's a lot of just do a work in the background, get a release out, and now we have sort of a release template. We have sort of guidance for what it means to release, reasons why we would try to cut a release. So I think we're moving in a positive direction there with just like every sort of workflow that we go through, we want to make sure that's documented. And with that, I think it's created that space in office hours where we can have the discussion of like, hey, can we change a principle? Can we not bend something, but so can we rethink this? That said, we try to also put some engineering in there where extensions are the place where you want to look first. So if you want to violate the principles, you need to sort of solve a problem outside the scope there. First, look to extensions. If that isn't solving the use case, then I think, let's come and think about how extensions might. So can we change some things there so that that'll work? And if that's still not workable, then, let's see how many other people are having the problem, so on and so forth, and have that discussion at office hours.
Awesome. Another question from Brendan. In macOS 10.15 plus, endpoint security framework has been added and Osquery has support for reading events. Would something like support for acting on ESF events, for example, rejecting events, be supported in the core Osquery?
That's another good question. I'm not very familiar with endpoint security. I don't know exactly what we can and cannot do with it. I have seen like Charville has a pull request up that gives us all the process starts in endpoint security. I think that's the tip of the iceberg. So we want to focus our effort on getting that added to Osquery, and we are making progress there. Once we have that, I think then we can do a bit more of a thorough exploration of what are the possibilities within endpoint security. If we wanted to turn Osquery into more of an enforcement tool, I think that's where we want to look to extensions, just because I think it doesn't violate, it would change the system state, so it would violate our guideline there. But I think another point to consider is like we don't have a lot of experience with that with the tool. So first we want to consider guidelines. Second, we want to consider like, can we support this from the experience the community brings? Are we sort of going out of our comfort zone? And if we are, let's make sure that we're doing it responsibly.
Perfect. Osquery is obviously incredibly powerful from a visibility standpoint, and we spoke a bit about transparency. What role does transparency play for you personally when it comes to contributing to this project and all the open source projects that are out there?
Yeah, I think I hold transparency in pretty high regard. To me, it means it means like looking at your behavior. If you're having sort of one-on-one conversations and you're working through a problem and you come to a conclusion, your responsibility is then to make sure you capture the important bits there and then sort of broadcast that or put it in a way that others can find it. So it doesn't mean that like all conversations forever have to be in the open. It just means you have to do your due diligence to make sure that there's no like behind the scenes decision making or sort of like behind the scenes consensus building. Like we want all that to be out in the open. And I think the straw man that you can build here is like if someone came and joined the community for the first time, they started looking through all the code, they looked through all the issues, they joined Slack and they started going through all the channels. If they had a question about why was something done the way it is, they could reconstruct that for themselves by reading the history. I say that because I don't mean to say that everyone should do that. I actually think there's a lot of value in just popping into one of the chats in Slack and being like, why do we do this way? Just ask the questions, totally fine. But the other people around you can then go fill in the gaps because they can sort of help with that work. So I think to me, transparency is mostly about that. Yeah. I was going to say, like, there are some edge cases there I could talk through, but I don't think it would add any. I don't think it'd add much value.
It's all good. We have a couple questions about what is your least and most favorite Osquery table and why?
Yeah, I think the USB devices and PCI devices gotta be my favorite. I think that I've always wanted an LSPCI on macOS, and so this is my sort of like pet project within pet project within pet project. It's like you can get that with Osquery pretty easily. I use that very often when attaching like random wacky devices. I want to know how the operating system read it, if it recognized it, so I can go out and do some more research and more reverse engineering. I think that implementing those two tables was a gateway to thinking about hardware events too, which was a gateway to thinking about events in general. So I have gotten a lot of value out of those personally, and I've been able to connect that to a lot of business impact. And then the follow-up work there with hardware events and so on and so forth, I think has been the same sort of story, like lots of impact from that. So if I had to pick one off the fly, I wasn't really prepared. I'm sure there's all these other great tables out there that deserve some limelight, but those are the two.
Fantastic. One thing that I wanted to ask is if I had a magic wand and I said, boop, right on top of Osquery, what's one thing that no matter how resource intensive, would you want to change? Any feature that you would want to enact if I could just turn the key and have it be available to everyone?
Yeah. Let me think about this while I say what immediately came to my head. Came to my head is correctness. And I don't think this is one sort of feature that we can add. I think it involves maybe like 50 to 100 diffs, 50 to 100 pull requests to sort of get this right. But let's say you don't get data back. You want to know why you didn't get data back. Or if you get a certain type of data back, or you get an integer that's like actually an enum, like -1, 0, 1, you sort of want to know why that happened. And I think surfacing that correctness is like the differentiating feature here. So I think one way to think about this is consider like machine learning. If you build a model in machine learning and there's a decision tree there, you can look at the outcome of the model, you can look at the decision, and if you want to interrogate why that decision was made, you go back to the decision tree and you can see the sort of percentages of why one branch would be taken over another. And so if somehow we could bind the data that you get back from Osquery or any sort of host visibility tool with that decision tree, like, hey, I called this API, it returned this results. That was an error, so I called the secondary API, and I went through this switch statement. If the data looked like this, if it looked like that, then I reported this sort of aggregate summary of like encryption's off. I don't know how you would build this. I think in a lot of tables, a lot of data, like there's a lot of nuance there, but surfacing that correctness and the decision behind why data was returned, I think that's my number one feature.
Okay, let's make it happen. One thing I wanted to bring up is I'm sure there are a lot of people that are listening to this talk right now. They want to contribute to Osquery, but maybe they want to start their own open source project. What would you recommend to that person that wants to step out on their own, pull a team together, and make something happen for the community?
Yeah. I think as humans, our number one motivation is novelty. I mean, it's kind of philosophical, but kind of think through your own motivations why you do something. I think novelty ends up being at the core of why we make a lot of decisions. We want to do something new. We want to experience something new. So with that, I think we end up putting artificial barriers around ourselves. We put ourselves in these boxes because if we can't think of something new to do, then we feel like nothing is worth being done. So now think, are you going to bed, or are you sort of walking home when we used to commute, walking around the block now that you're trying to get some exercise and clean, fresh air?
Yeah.
And if there's a project you want to start or a new language that you want to learn, or if you want to just get started in the open source community, are you thinking for something new to do? Are you searching for like what can be the gap that you fill? If you are, I think you're limiting yourself. And I think there's a lot of space for just redoing something a little bit better or modernizing something. It doesn't mean jump into a project and sort of improve something here and there. It's like, hey, start a commit number one, initial commit, and just try to re-implement something that you've seen in the past, but a little bit better or with your own spin. I think that, one, you're going to be able to get started right now. And two, I really feel like you'll end up in a place where you have improved that thing, not for searching for novelty, but just because you wanted to do something good, you wanted to make an improvement. So that's sort of off the top of my head, that would be my recommendation.
No, I love that. And that reminds me of something that I think about quite often. I live in this realm of creativity, of content creation quite often, but I often look at the people that I work with, the engineers that I lead, and sometimes we forget to be creative. We kind of lose that childlike feeling when we play, have fun, because that's where a lot of discovery ends up happening. What would you recommend for folks to get back to creativity, to think a little differently and have a little bit of fun?
Interesting. Yeah. In the realm of building some open source software, how do you bring out that creativity? Yeah, I think I have a 1-year-old son, and I can sort of watch him discover things for the first time. And I describe him as like a little fuzzer. Like if you consider fuzzing some software, finding vulnerabilities, it sort of runs around the space. Like I think I picked up everything on the floor, but now he'll find something else. Like he's a little fuzzer. But he's not really asking for any input. He's sort of figuring out on his own. And I can see him figure things out, find things that I would never have considered. Kind of like a fuzzer. Like a fuzzer is going to find some input that crashes your system or crashes your program that you weren't going to think about or would have taken you too much time to actually find. So maybe there's something to take away from that, which is if you're going to start off on a new project, right? Maybe don't seek a lot of like how this was done before, or don't look up like how you connect two dots. Kind of try to figure it out yourself. It's going to take more time. It's going to be more frustrating, but you might add your special creativity to that and find out something that is phenomenal. Whereas before, if you were just going and searching at how this little feature was implemented, you would want to move fast, and you're just going to copy and paste how it was solved before.
Awesome. One last question for you, Teddy. When that time comes and you decide to step away from the project, what do you hope that legacy is for Osquery, the legacy for the open source community at large? What do you hope that legacy is that you leave behind when you finally step away from the project?
Yeah. I haven't really thought a lot about that. Not really planning to step away unless someone wants me to step away.
No, we're hoping many, many years down the line.
Yeah. I sort of like the place where I am in right now, which is mostly just I want to help other people. Like I want to encourage other people to contribute. I want to remove roadblocks so that you can contribute. So that's sort of the function I see myself fulfilling right now. I think a lot of people, when they work on an open source project or an internal project, they want to see it last. And so they want to see like this legacy. I think I feel that way too, but I don't feel like that's the correct, I don't think that's like the best feeling to have. So I've tried to like check myself here, and I think I'm happy with what it's achieved so far. And if suddenly there is some better implementation out there of host visibility, I'd hope people make the right choice and start using that versus use something that they're familiar with, they're comfortable with, but isn't sort of like the best solution for the job. When we first started Osquery, we wanted to build something better, and we would hope that like people would start using it because it was a bit better. So the next thing that comes along, I hope that people would go and use that. But I would also hope, I think this is the answer to your question. I would hope that that next thing took a little bit of influence from Osquery, even if it's just like Osquery didn't do these things well, so we're going to avoid that. If it's just that, fine. I would really like it if they instead said, hey, Osquery did this really, really well. And so when we do something else, we want to make sure we mimic at least that like experience or that feel or that feature. So I guess I want the project to be one of those giants that others stand on,
Yeah, no, from my perspective, I think what you guys have built has been incredible, at least from the cybersecurity side of the house. We really appreciate all the work, time, and attention that everyone's put into it. And thank you so much for hopping on the mic and talking with me today and sharing your wisdom with everyone. For anyone that wants to stay up to date with you and all the things that you're doing with Osquery, what are the best ways that people could do that?
Yeah, Slack is the best choice. And I'm one of a bunch of technical committee members. I think, you could have the same sort of discourse, the same sort of questions with anyone else on the technical steering committee. You'll get some pretty good answers. You'll get different perspectives, which I think is really valuable. So yeah, please don't be shy. Hop on Slack. There's a link on the GitHub. We want to spread that link as far and fast as possible. And then hop into the core channel. I think the core channel gets a lot of visibility from people who have been working on the project for a while. So if you want to ask questions about why is something done, or want to propose like, why don't we do this differently? That's going to get some attention, and you're probably going to get some feedback fast. But you can ask the question in any other channel. I think you won't get that audience as fast as possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Teddy. And thanks everybody else for tuning in with us today and spending some time with us. And with that, we'll see everybody next time.
No problem.